Hi there, welcome to video number 3 in the sequence of setting up my hardware using Axis and Ohs to control the C172. It's the what people call the steam gauge version, not the glass cockpit version. So it's got the Garmin 530, in fact it's got a Garmin 530 and a 430. Video 1, I went through how I would plan the layout, particularly of the X-Touch controller, the mini controller that I use, to make good use of all of the buttons and make sure they're logically laid out and easy to use in flight. Video number 2, I went through showing you how I would use, because I could set up the 530 and in fact the 430 as well without using any scripts. The difficulty with that is that it takes up just about every control there is on the X-Touch. It doesn't leave any room for, say, your transponder or the autopilot. You can't add those on. So you do run out of rotaries pretty quickly on that. So this one here, we're going to look at using scripts to make better use of the layout. It is fairly script heavy. I don't think it's too difficult, but let's bear with it. So this is the layout we're looking at, this 530 and the 430, and all these controls here have actually two rotaries. They're stacked one inside the other, an outer and an inner, and this one here controls megahertz and kilohertz, and this one here controls the GPS, an outer button knob and an inner knob that do slightly different functions on the GPS. I mean, we'll see those as we go along. But the units are pretty well identical, so it makes logical sense to sort of lay them out and use a button to toggle between controlling the 530 and the 430, because the buttons are pretty much the same. So this is the layout we'll be looking at here. So we're going to use this one single rotary to do both the megahertz and the kilohertz. So it'll be megahertz by default, unless we press this button on the end and it will toggle to kilohertz. Press it again, it go back to megahertz. What that means though is the button on the end of there normally would switch us between the comms radio and the navigation radio, the one that looks at the VORs. So we're going to move that button down to here. And this one here, that's the GPS, and again we're going to toggle between it acting as the outer or the inner rotary, and the end of that would normally be the cursor, so we'd have to bring that down to here, and we're going to use this one here to switch between controlling the 530 or the 430. So we need to have a variable behind that so that we know which one we're doing. We need a variable behind that so we can keep track of whether we're talking about megahertz or kilohertz, and we need a variable here to toggle between the outer and inner, just that we keep track of what we're doing. So here's the thought process. I want to control the 530 by default. Now we're going to create a variable, and when they're created they are zero, they are false by default. So if I create a variable saying it's the 430, it will say and you're not controlling it by default, so therefore I must be controlling the 530 by default, and that's what I want to happen. So we are going to create a variable that looks at the state of the 430. Am I talking to the 430 or not? And then we have a script which just toggled it between 1 and 0, or false and true. And the script looks like this. It's a local variable. We create local variables. Now, other things can create local variables. Axis and Ohs create some itself, and the aircraft developers can create local variables. So we have to create a name. We have to use a name that isn't going to clash with anything that anybody else might have used. So I've got this convention that I start it with my 430. You can call it what you like as long as you keep track of it, but that's the convention I've been using. So this script reads like this. If there's not a variable, create it, then look at the value. The value of course will be 0 to start with, but when I press on the button I want it to change to become 1. So this section here, that sign is a logical knot. It inverts zeros to ones and ones to zeros. These dots here are actually spaces, the space bar being pressed. Spaces are critical in this scripting language, so it makes it visible by actually putting dots rather than the spaces. So I'm not typing a full stop or anything, I'm typing a space, and that comes up automatically like that. So this is the variable again, and this sign says write to it, inputs into it. So if it's 0, flip it over to become a 1 and write it back in. If it's 1, flip it to 0 and write it back in. And that's how the script works. What I will sort of show you in Axis and Ohs how we produce scripts, but I'm not going to type them all in. I've got them all pre-prepared, but I'll just show you sort of the basics of using the script editor. But these are the scripts here for the G530 and 430. They're all contained in a script group, like a folder. And we create the folder up here. We manage the script groups. We just type in the name, whatever you want to call it. Again, I keep it called my, so I know that I've written it. I've not downloaded it from anywhere else. So this is my G530, 430, and add it, and it'll be there in the group. And then if I was going to create a new script to go in there, I would choose that script group here. So I want it to go into my G530, 430 script group and give the script a title. So to get that script, it doesn't exist. Okay, there's no shortcut click because it's this variable doesn't exist yet. So I would just literally type it in. Now I've got the habit of opening and closing my brackets straight away, so I can't forget to close a bracket. And we just type it in, my 430. And I'm going to use that again in a second. So we'll Control A, Control C, and now I'll put spacebar, exclamation mark, spacebar, and Control V to paste it in, and that's it, that's complete. So I'd give the script a title, and then down the bottom here I would save that as new. If you've already saved it and you make an edit to it, this will come alive saying update, so you can update it rather than save it as new. Okay, so that's it, that's the basics of writing a script. That script clearly is already in here, along with all the other ones that we're going to have to work our way through. Don't lose heart, most of them are really easy. We'll do the hard part at the beginning, and then we'll tail off with the nice easy stuff at the end. So that one here is this one here, my 530 430 toggle. And what I want to do is to actually allocate that to a button on my X-Touch. Let's bring the X-Touch up so you can see it. And I'm going to allocate it to this button here. So we're going to switch between the 530 and the 430 using that button there. So the assignment's dead easy. It'll be in a group here. As soon as you've got a script, it'll be in a group. My G530 430 group, and it's going to be that toggle here. Now, to save us sort of going through and hunting down all the time, we can use a filter here. So I can use my G5 as a filter. If we apply that filter, it kind of narrows it down into my group. So I want to use that one there, allocate that one, press the button, and click add, and that's done. Now nothing is going to actually happen, there's nothing visible for us to know that's going to happen. What we can do is we can watch simulator variables. So I've got a variable here which I created, which was my, so let's we'll select it here and we'll filter for it here. Apply that filter and it'll be in here. There it is, there's my variable there. If you haven't if it doesn't appear, all you need to do is to press that a couple of times just so that it's been used, and then it will appear. Sometimes they don't appear until you've actually used them. So let's narrow that down and we'll just have a look at what's going on with that variable. So when I press this button here, it should flip between 0 and 1. 0 is the G530, 1 is the 430. And that's working. So that's it, that's the toggling business. So the next thing we need to do is to create the variable in exactly the same way to check out whether we're looking at the kilohertz or megahertz when we go to increase and decrease our frequencies on the radio. So it's the same logic. Because the new variables will be 0 by default, I want to use the kilohertz as my variable because I'm going to not control that. I'm going to control the megahertz by default. So it's going to be here. That's the script, creating a variable for my kilohertz, which will be 0, but there's the toggle business. So I don't really need to type that in again, but I'll just show you that it is here. And I called it the kilohertz toggle, and there's that script. So again, we just go and allocate that one. And we just use our filter here. And these are in alphabetical order. And there's my kilohertz toggle. And I'm allocating that to this press button here. So I'm going to press the button on the end of that rotary and add that in, and that's done. So I now know whether I'm doing kilohertz or megahertz, and I know whether I'm doing the 530 or the 430. Okay, I want to be able to change between doing the comms radio or the voice radio. Now, I don't need to create a variable for that. The system is going to use an internal variable itself to keep track of whether we're using the comms or the nav radios. And we'll access that later on. You'll see why we need to access it. But I'm just going to use the first variable I created to check which one I'm talking to. So this one here is how the RPN, the reverse Polish notation, works. It says find that value and this value here and compare the two. So the actual operation comes at the end. These are the two things I want you to compare. And if they're both 0, then you must be talking to the 530, so send this command. So the if has a curly brace around the bits I want to do if it's true. Else, and there's no E on the end of else, notice that. Here's the curly brackets here, do this. So this is going to send a 1 to this command, this input event. Okay, let's go and build that in the script editor and I'll show you how that works. So let's just move things around so I can see what I'm getting for. Okay, so we want that variable in there, which is a variable we created, so we can actually pick it from here. So I want that put into here, so that saves me typing. I want you to compare it to 0, check if they're equal, and then it's an if command. Now I've broken this up here to make the structure easier. You normally type it all in one line, so again I'm putting the curly brackets in just to make sure that it's all balanced. What I want to do is to hunt down this input event. So I'm going to search for a sim event, and these are relatively new, these Microsoft input events, which are here. And they're specific to the aircraft that you've got loaded and are running at the moment. And I want to have the 530 one. So this input event, we can actually sort of filter down for it. And they call it the AS 530. So we'll apply that filter. and that narrows it down. It makes it a lot easier for us. I'm looking for the CV push. Oh, and there it is. So just double click on there, and that's put in there. So if that's happening there, you might as well come to a new line. It just makes the structure nicer. Else, and now we want to input the 430 event. So again, we can do that. Insert sim event and narrow it down to the AS430. So that'll be setting it to push the CV button for the 430, and that's that script written. But of course, I've got that already written, allocated. So if we look into here, that's the CV one. So the CV swap is what I'm after. So allocating that one. My CV swap allocated to this button here. What we really ought to do now is go in the cockpit and just check that we're seeing those things working. So when I press the CV swap, I'm talking to the 530 and it's swapping between controlling the V-lock and the comms lock. Now if I press the 430 and press that, it's controlling that one. So we know we've got that right. Let's put it back to the 530. Okay, so we're kind of getting somewhere now. So the next thing we need to do is to look at how we would increase the frequency. And this is the logic we need to go through. Firstly, we want the script to check whether we're talking to the 530 or the 430. And so it's checking this variable. If it's 0, then we must be talking to the 530. Then the next question it asks is, are you doing megahertz or kilohertz? And again, if it's 0, we must be doing megahertz. If it's 1, we'll be doing kilohertz. So you can see the command here is it's talking to the 530. It's talking to both the COM and the nav radio, and the workings of the GPS. It's got its own variable, so it knows whether it's in comms mode or nav mode. So it'll sort that out for us. So we just send the command saying we are going to increase, and that one there means increase the megahertz or the kilohertz. And then again, we've got the other option that if it detects that we're talking to the 430, it checks whether it's megahertz or kilohertz we want to increase and send the 430 version of the megahertz or the kilohertz. So there's 4 possible outcomes from this logic. And if you actually look at that as a script, it looks like this. It's the frequency increase and checking here, are we talking to the 430? And if we are, work your way through this, and this is check if we're looking at kilohertz or megahertz, and it'll be megahertz by default. So we must be talking to the 430. We must be doing megahertz if they're both zeros. So we'll send that to the 530. If not, we must be talking about kilohertz, so it sends the 1 to the kilohertz version. If that is a 1, ignore that and do this, and it's exactly the same thing. It says to the 430, send the megahertz or kilohertz. So that's what the script looks like. So we've got here the megahertz increase. In fact, it does megahertz and kilohertz. It should be called frequency increase, really. But there it is. That's the whole script written out. So again, that's the one we want to allocate. So the megahertz increase is being allocated to this rotary here. So I just turn the rotary. Now the first time I turn it, just one click, all it knows is I've clicked it. It doesn't know in which direction I'm turning, so you have to continue turning, and 2 clicks is enough, but more than 2 clicks doesn't hurt. But it knows I've turned that to the right. So that's the increase done. So we can click add on that. And the decrease version is pretty much the same logic. It checks if we're looking at the 430 or the 530. It checks whether you want megahertz or kilohertz, but the command it sends is marginally different in that it sends a -1 rather than a 1. That's the only difference between the two in the script. The logic is exactly the same, but the command at the end of it marginally different. So the script is the same. If you were typing this in, you would just copy and paste and change that, just insert the minus sign. It's as quick as that. So again, allocate that. And that will be my megahertz, badly named really, my frequency decreaser. And same trick applies, turn it a couple of times so it registers that you turned it to the left. Click add. And then let's pop into the cockpit and see this actually working. So I'm doing the 530, I'm in voice mode, comms mode, and you can see the megahertz are increasing. And in fact, if you look here, you can actually see the animation of the rotary turning. If I turn it the opposite direction, it does what I want to do. If I click on the end here, I'm now doing the kilohertz in both directions. If I press on this, I'll be doing exactly the same, but for the nav radios. If I swap this, I'm now talking to the comms on the 430. Notice that I was in nav mode here, but when I switch to here, it's comms. They've got their own independent variable to know which mode you've left them in. So if I press this here now, this will be controlling megahertz and kilohertz for that nav radio. But if I go back to here, I can have that in comms mode, and this will stay in nav mode. So the system is absolutely working. What we need to do now is to get these buttons here working so that it changes the standby to active for all of those. So these are the swaps. The standby for the active. So we're going to use the 430 variable again to work out whether we're talking to the 430 or the 530. And we need to know whether the device, the 530 and indeed the 430, is in comms mode or nav swap mode, so that it sends the right command, because it's got a comms swap and a nav swap. So there is a variable called the selected source for the 530 and the 430. Okay, so that's the variable we're after. So let's see if we can find that variable in the scripting area here. So we're in our scripts area. We're looking for the AS530. And it's down as a local variable, an LVAR, and that's not there. And you'll notice it's not there either. So it's actually one that was a bit difficult to track down, and if I show you how I tracked it down, in developing mode, in the tools, looking at the behavior here for the 172, in the local variables here, there we got AS530 selected source, and at the moment it's 1. When it's in that mode there, it's a 1. If I switch modes here, AS530 selected source, you can see the value is now 2. So I'll flick that back again, and you can see the variable changing from 1 to 2, and there's a 430 version of that as well. So that's where I discovered it. Okay, so the script that we're looking at here is the active swap. So it checks whether we're looking at the 530 or 430. It checks which mode it's in. Are you in comms mode? If it's 1, then send the comms swap command to the 530, and that's again one of those input events. Else send a nav swap, and we do the same for the 430. Just check whether this is 1. Now this enum, it's got to get the value, and it has to enumerate it to make it into a number so we can compare it. So that's just a little extra that you need to put in there if it doesn't come automatically. I can't remember if it comes automatically or not. Without messing my own script up, what I'm going to do is I'll just insert that sim event. So I want to look for com swap on the 530. Yes, 530. In the input events, com swap. I'm just going to put that into my script for a second. Nope, you have to type it in yourself. So you have to type com space enum at the end of that to make it work. So I'm not going to save that, obviously. I'm going to just ditch out of that, so don't mess my script up. Okay, so that's what's going to go onto this swap button here. This is my active swap going on to this one here. Click add, and then we'll just check it out in the cockpit here. So when I press swap there, I can see the active swapping for this one here. If I put it into VLOC mode, that's swapping. Let's swap it over to the 430, and that is in VLOC mode and comms mode. So the swaps are happening. It depends on which device that we are controlling. Okay, so that's the standby and the active swap done. Now we have to turn our attention to the GPS, the rotaries on that side. So again, we need a variable created so that we can swap using this button here between controlling the inner and the outer, and it's exactly the same logic as before. So we're controlling the outer one by default. So we'll just allocate that one straight away. So it's this one here, it's the inner toggle. Is the one that I've created, and we'll allocate that to this button here, so we know we're controlling the inner or the outer. So click on add, and that's allocated. Right, now that was the logic that I used. Let's get rid of the X-Touch for a minute. This is the logic I used to do the actual frequency increase. I checked the device first, which one we want to talk to. I checked whether it's megahertz or kilohertz, and then decided the command to send. I used a slightly different method for no particular reason. I wanted to try it out to do the GPS version of it. So let's get that out of the way. I'll just leave it up there for some comparison. What I decided to do was to check logic in a different order. Firstly, check whether I want inner or outer, and then check which one I want to talk to, whether it's the 530 or the 430, and then use that to come down here. So I'm doing the outer one because it's 0, and then I can talk to the 530 or the 430. It ends up the same really at the end of it, but I just wanted to see how well this logic worked. So again, we've got down to talk to the 530 and increase the outer, and the bottom one here, talk to the 430, increase the outer. That one is the inner being increased for the 530 and the 430. So that's one change I made. I just asking the questions in a slightly different order, but I also wanted to see what would happen if we didn't put it all in one script, but to break the script up a little bit. So this is the one that asking, are we doing the inner or the outer, and then call another script that I wrote. So the outer has its own script, which I wrote, so that's why it calls it here, exactly named as my script, and then that decides whether it's the 430 or the 530 that we're talking to, and the same for the inner, creating another script. So I've got this idea of one script calling another, and if you look in my scripts editor, you can kind of see what's going on here. So there's the GPS there. So my GPS increase checks out whether I want to control the inner or the outer, and then calls the appropriate script. And you see their K's, the key events. If you insert your own script by looking it up in here and double clicking, putting it in, it puts it in as a key event straight away automatically. So it just saves you typing them in. I just think it makes the script look a bit cleaner. And then, so obviously this is going to call the right script here. So this one's going to call the GPS outer increase, and that will check, do I want to send the increase to the 430 or the 530. So that's the GPS increase is what we want to send, want to allocate, which was which was this one here. Sorry, it's a bit disjointed. I'm getting a couple of phone calls coming through at the moment, so just had to pause some recordings and deal with a few bits and pieces. Okay, so that's what I want to allocate, the increase button there. So GPS increase allocated to that one there, and decrease as well. And we'll turn that the opposite direction. Click on that. So the decrease is actually pretty much the same that we're looking at here. Of course, the script is called decrease, and we've got the -1 to make sure that it decreases when we do it. So we can again go back into the cockpit and just check that out. So this GPS button here, we're controlling the 530 at the moment, and you can see that I'm using the outer knob to step through the main sort of groups. And now if I click on that, on the end of that, I should be doing the inner knob, so I step between the sub pages in there. Click on it again, and I'm doing the outer option here. And then if I click on the 530, 430, I should be controlling the outer and the inner for that one, and that's working absolutely fine. So it's now the push cursor on the end of that we need to control. So the cursor, again, it's pretty simple. It's got to decide whether we're talking to the 530 or the 430 and just send the appropriate command. So if it's if the 430 is 0, send a cursor push to the 530 and back again. Okay, so let's allocate that. So I'm looking for my cursor one here, and here it is. Double click on there. And allocate that to this button here. Add. So let's just take stock of where we are. We've got the toggle working, we've got the megahertz, kilohertz. We can change between the 530 and the 430. We can change whether we're talking to the comms radio or the nav radio. We can swap the active for each of them for both devices, and we can control the GPS and the cursor. So that's kind of the hard work done. So really we're now just into these buttons here, which are really quite simple. The same structure for all of them. All it needs is one if statement, just checking whether we're talking to the 430 and the 530, and the input events are all easily accessible when you're writing the script. Let's go to the script editor. They're all in the sim events. So if you just filter for the AS530 or the 430, and you'll find them all here, and they're in alphabetical order, and they're labelled really logically. So we're doing the CDI button, the OBS button that's there, and if I just drop out of that, the structure for all of these scripts is exactly the same. Just check. So it's a cut and paste, a copy and paste job. Just checking whether you're talking to the 530, the 430, and the 530. And we can go CDI, OBS, the message button, the flight plan button, the VNAV. There isn't a VNav on the 430, but I've kept the structure the same. It doesn't do any harm if it's there. It just doesn't have any effect. Working our way across procedure, so they're all allocated. So allocating those is absolutely simple. So if I'm working my way across, if I do the CDI first of all, press that button, allocate, click add. I'm going to pause the recording and I'll just put the others in so you don't have to see me doing all the other buttons. Okay, so we're back again now. So I've worked my way across here, allocated CDI, OBS, message, flight plan, VNav, and the procedures. So they're all allocated. So the next ones I want to allocate are the ones across the bottom here. So there's a little bit of variation there. So the range up, it's the same structure, checking which one we're talking to, but range up has a 1 as its input, and range down has a -1 as its input. So they're two different scripts for the range up and range down, but just variations on the theme really. So we'll just allocate those in now as well. So I'll do range up on this one here and range down on the next one. And we'll just check that's happening properly. We'll get into the cockpit and have a look at what's going on there. So it should affect the zoom on the map. So there's up and down, and the same thing will happen if I change it over to the 430. That affects the map there. So we know that's working absolutely perfectly. The direct is exactly the same. You pick up that event, just checking whether it's talking to 530 or 430, so we'll allocate that in. There's my direct. Add that in. And the next one here is the menu. And then we come across to the next next one, and this is the clear button. And if you actually look in the cockpit, the clear button has two functions. The first function is clearing an input. If you've been putting an input in, say a waypoint or something, you want to clear what you're doing, just one click on that and clears that. But the other thing that it does, if we just sort of nip across into the depth somewhere, if you hold this clear button down for a few seconds, what it does is it brings you back to the default map. So if you're lost in the menu system somewhere, holding it down for a few seconds actually sort of takes you back to the default page, and it says here to default nav. So we want to emulate two things happening on the same button here. First, let's have a look at the two scripts that we've got for it. So the ordinary clear is just checking which device we're talking to and sending the clear command. So that's fairly easy. I think this works. I've tried it a couple of times now, and putting a -1 in it seems to be the long clear version. So let's check it out. Let's firstly, in Axis and Ohs, allocate it. So we're allocating two things. The first thing is the normal clear. So here's my clear. I'll allocate that to this button here, but we also want to have a long click, and we determine what we mean by a long click here. I'm just rolling the wheel on the mouse, and I'm going to make it sort of longer than a second, something like that, and that's going to go into here. We allocate the other script for this one here. The long clear, that's the one with the -1 in it. So we'll allocate that, and it's allocated to the same button, so I don't have to press anything again. It's just, it knows that's a long click, and we'll click add. So let's go back into the cockpit and try it out, just check it. So we'll do what we did before. We'll sort of head into, say, the waypoint system. We're a couple of pages in. If I press the clear button just once, it's not doing anything because there's nothing to clear, there's no input happening. But if I hold it down for over a second, that brings us back to the nav page. So I'm pretty sure that that's working now. So that's my long clear version. And the last one is the enter button, so that's dead easy to allocate. So here's my enter one, and we'll just allocate that to that button. No tricks needed for this one, just click add. So kind of, I think we're there. We've worked our way across all of these here, and everything's allocated. The last thing I want to do in this one is to actually have some button lights, some LEDs coming up, so I know whether I'm in 430 or 530 mode, or whether I'm, for whichever device I'm talking to, whether it's in comms or nav mode, and whether it's in kilohertz or megahertz or outer or inner. So I'm going to do some LED scripts. And this is what the LED script looks like. We need to talk over MIDI and send MIDI commands to it. So the first one is looking at just checking here. It's looking at this one here, and to check whether it's in kilohertz or megahertz mode. If it's in kilohertz, if it's not in kilohertz, if it's in megahertz mode, I want it to switch all the LEDs off. So that tells it to send a 0 across MIDI to device number 7. Now you need to know which device your X-Touch is. And if I go here to show MIDI devices, don't worry about the MIDI in, it's the MIDI out. You're talking to it, and it's on device number 7 for me. That's my setup. So you need to check yours to make sure you know your ID number for your MIDI. It doesn't change once it's allocated. I don't think so, unless you do a major change to your hardware. But that's on my device, it's number 7. So that has to be reflected here. To device number 7, we're sending a control change. This is channel 1. Channel 1 is a universal channel. Every command gets sent over channel 1, and it only the device hears it because it's got its own index number. So send it over channel 1, and this one here is number 9. This rotary here is number 9. So we're sending a 0 to it. If it's in kilohertz mode, switch all the LEDs on, and 27 is the number, the magic number that turns it all on for number 9. Okay, so that's how we deal with this one here. Again, it's the same thing for this one here, which is number 10. So check whether we're using the inner one. If it's the outer one, if it is 0, send a 0, turn all these LEDs off, over MIDI to device number 7, a control change, over channel 1 to device number 10, to rotary 10, or turn, the opposite version is turn all the LEDs on to number 10. That's easy. Okay, next one. I want to know whether I'm in 430 mode or 530 mode. By default it'll be in 430. So this one is kind of simpler. It just says look at the value and send that value over MIDI device number 7. It's a note on command this time, not a CC, it's a note on, over channel 1, and this is bulb number 1. They're numbered 0 to 7, 8 to 15, so this is bulb number 1, so we're sending it to bulb number 1. So it's going to send whatever's in here. If it's 0, it will send a 0 and turn it off, because that means we're in the 530 mode. If it's a 1, we're in 430 mode, and it'll turn that bulb on. And the last one is the slightly more complicated one. Again, we need to know whether we're looking at the 530 or the 430. So if we're looking at the 530, do this. It says get the value of the selected source. Now if you remember way back in the video, we looked at that and it was 1 or 2. It wasn't 0 and 1, it was 1 for voice and 2 for the nav radio. So do this enumeration thing again, and this time take 1 off of it. So if it's 1, take 1 off and send a 0 to this bulb here. This is bulb number 8. If it's a 2, take 1 off of it, subtract 1 and send a 1 to it. So we're going to send 0s and 1s, but we have to calculate them here to send it over here. And this is the, if you're in the 430 mode, again check the status of the 430 variable, subtract the 1 and send it across to here. So that is the LED script to make all these lights work. We need to allocate that, we need that script running all the time. So what we do is we go into scripting here and we want to set it just for this this aircraft, an automated script from my G530 430, and I want it to do the LEDs, and I want it to repeat. It doesn't really matter how quickly it repeats, it just doesn't make any difference. The powerful processors we've got these days really makes no odds. So I said allocate it, so that should be running now, and you should see lights coming on, things happening. Let's get into the cockpit and just check a few things out. So this says I'm in the 430 mode. 430 is in comms mode because this light's gone off. If I press this one here, it's now said I'm in the 530 mode and it's in nav mode. Let's put it to comms mode. Absolutely right. Let's put this into kilohertz mode. So when I'm turning that as kilohertz, all the LEDs are off now. We're in megahertz mode. That mode is retained as we switch between the two devices, so it's totally happy with that. And we'll do the same for this one, the GPS. So I'm turning the outer knob, press on there, lights are on, so I'm turning the inner knob. Let's bring the cursor up. Let's go to flight plan mode. Bring the cursor up, which means I can now step through and enter. Let's go to EGLL. So I'm turning the inner knob at the moment, and click on here to turn the outer knob, so I move along one space, click again, EGLL, press enter and accept that, and that's in our flight plan. Turn the cursor off. So anyway, that's it. I'm not going to go through all the functions of the 530 and the 430. That's a whole other video in its own one day. But anyway, all I've done is made sure that I can get all these buttons to work. I can jump from flight plan, I can turn on the messages, which there isn't any, of course. So the buttons are all working. I can switch between the different modes. Let's go back. Let's get out of flight plan. I can go into the nav mode. I can step through the different pages within nav. So everything seems to be working fine. Okay, so that's the 530 and 430 done, which is, I know it's a long video. I will put links in the description to all the other videos once I've got the whole sequence made, and I'll hopefully try and get some chapter marks put into here as well, but that's quite an onerous task. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was worthwhile. Thanks a lot for looking, and I'll see you in the next video.